include Barbara Slavin. She is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a lecturer in international affairs here at the Elliott School of George Washington University. She is the author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation, and a career journalist, having previously served as assistant managing editor for World and National Security at the Washington Times, senior diplomatic reporter for USA Today, the Cairo correspondent for The Economist, and is an editor at the New York Times Week in Review. Naysan Rafati is Crisis Group's Iran senior analyst. His research is focused on the Iran nuclear deal and Iran's regional policies. He has written for a variety of publications, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Le Monde Diplomatique, and the Financial Times. Prior to joining Crisis Group, Naysan was a transatlantic postdoctoral fellow in international relations and security at the RAND Corporation and at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He holds a PhD or a DPhil in Oriental Studies from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, where he was awarded the Albert Harani and Jenkins Memorial Scholarships and taught various courses on Middle East politics and history. Today's panel will be chaired and moderated by Sina Azodi, who is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and a visiting scholar here at the Institute for Middle East Studies, and a PhD candidate in international affairs. Sina previously worked as a research assistant at Princeton University's program on science and global security and at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He is a frequent commentator on both English and Persian-speaking media, including BBC Persian Service, Sky News, Al Jazeera, and many others. Sina earned his BA and his MA in International Affairs here at the Elliott School, so we're excited to have him back here, and he also teaches here for us. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Sina. If anyone needs a mask, there's some in the back, and we will be recording this, so please.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you everyone for coming. And Mona, I just want to thank you for the opportunity for the event. And Barbara, Naysan, thank you for coming. So this is indeed a timely event. The talks to restore the JCPOA have gone through optimism to pessimism, from pessimism to optimism. And at this point, we don't know where we're going. So with that, Naysan, let me ask you this. What is the status of Iran's nuclear program right now? And where are we with the talks?
Simple questions to get us kicked off then. Well, thank you, Sina, for putting this on. It's funny you use the word timely. I would love there to be a time when it's not timely to be discussing Iran's nuclear program, but here we are. And to give you a sense of where we are in the negotiations, I suppose, is to a certain extent, knowing that we have some graduate students and undergraduate students who may not have followed the to and fro of the nuclear negotiations over the past 19 years. Instead of starting with where we are, which you could say is Act 3 in a play, we can start with Act 1 and 2 so you have a bit of context. In 2015, Iran and the 5 members of the Security Council and Germany reached an agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The JCPOA, they really should have worked on the name as well, but it's 150 odd pages, a very complicated text that boils down to a fairly simple bargain at its core. And that bargain is that Iran would restrict its nuclear program, which had been disclosed in the early 2000s and become an escalating crisis over the course of a decade or so, restrict its nuclear program, put its nuclear activity under monitoring and verification of the UN's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's part 1 of the bargain. Part 2 of the bargain is that Iran would receive sanctions relief from layers of US, European, and UN sanctions that had built up over the course of several years. So to distill 150 odd pages of very, very detailed text, that's the bargain. Restrict the nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. So that's Act 1. Act 2 begins with the Trump administration's decision over a year after the Trump administration took office to leave the JCPOA in May of 2018. As a candidate, President Trump was critical of the agreement for what it contained, namely nuclear restrictions didn't go far enough or weren't robust enough, and what it didn't contain, i.e. it's a nuclear deal not covering things that are not nuclear. And as Barbara has written, and many of you will be familiar with, the litany of issues of divergence between the US and Iran under the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration extend well beyond the nuclear file. They extend to Iran's domestic human rights situation, its regional power projection, its deployment and proliferation of ballistic missiles, its hostility towards US allies, and its hostility towards the US itself. So the litany of grievances is long. The nuclear issue was regarded by the US, by the P5+1, as the key strategic issue, and that's why the nuclear issue focused on the nuclear. And the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the deal went big. It was a theory of everything approach that said that this deal is insufficient, and withdrawing from the deal and putting in place what was dubbed a policy of maximum pressure can yield a bigger deal and a better deal. And you can look at the requirements that the US laid out for what this policy should have as its end game. These were laid out by Secretary of State Pompeo at the Heritage Foundation in May of 2018, and they are sweeping. Zero enrichment for Iran, ending its proliferation of ballistic missiles, curtailing its support for the Houthis in Yemen, stopping supporting paramilitary units in Iraq, drawing down on its support for the Assad regime in Syria, again curtailing its support and backing for Hezbollah in Lebanon, and stopping its military and financial assistance to Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, right? So that's the list, to which was later added human rights as well. So those were the ends, and the tools were the deployment of US unilateral sanctions, which were quite effective, especially in 2018 and 2019 when Iran went through 2 years of negative GDP growth. But at the same time, Iran began to respond, especially from mid-2019 onwards, with a counter-pressure campaign. And that has as one element of it a nuclear escalation, starting to breach the terms of the nuclear agreement, because coming back to that core bargain, Iran's contested that, well, if we're not getting the sanctions relief that the JCPOA envisions, why should we comply with the nuclear provisions? And so beginning in 2019, they start to progressively breach the restrictions on how much uranium they can stockpile, how high they can enrich, how many centrifuges they can deploy. That's the nuclear side of it. And then on the regional side of it, we start to see a counter-pressure campaign manifesting through increased threats against US interests and US allies. For those of you who remember the summer of 2019, there were tankers blowing up in the Gulf, there were escalations between US and Iranian forces with a drone shoot down. There was the killing of Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, to which Iran responded by firing missiles at a US base in Iraq. And so by the end of the Trump administration, Iran's stockpiles have grown such that the breakout time, which is defined as the time of having sufficient fissile material for one weapon, had dropped from a year under the deal to around 3 to 4 months at the end of the Trump administration. And we'd had this track record of regional provocations and counter responses in a search for establishing deterrence. And that's Act 2. So then we get to Act 3, which is the Biden administration taking office and saying that its goal is to restore the JCPOA, come back into mutual US and Iranian compliance with the 2015 agreement. And that begins the process in Vienna that starts in April of last year. And in many ways, it's a very bizarre process, what we've had over the past year and a half. On the one hand, you're negotiating over a deal you've already agreed to, and you're trying to figure out how to re-enter it. Second oddity of it is that due to the Iranians' insistence, there are no US-Iran direct talks. Everything is ferried through intermediaries, through the E3 or the EU or the Russians or the Chinese. So you're negotiating over a deal that's already been negotiated. The two central protagonists aren't talking to each other. And after the start of Ukraine, even the E3 and the Russians have had much more limited discussions amongst themselves. So there are layers of oddity to this entire process. But I dash two forward. So these talks begin in April, and by June they've made a degree of progress, but Iran's elections are on the horizon, and the talks go into a major pause for 5 months as there's a transition in Tehran from the government of Hassan Rouhani, whose administration in the first term negotiated the deal, to the more conservative, hardline, whatever nomenclature you prefer, administration of President Raisi. And it's not until November of last year, so a gap of about 5 months, when the negotiations resume. And over the course of the negotiations that had happened between April and June, there have basically been 3 buckets of issues. 3 working groups have been convening in Vienna. One group was looking at sanctions. Which sanctions is the US putting on the table to take off? Because the Trump administration had restored JCPOA sanctions and expanded many of them. But the Biden administration's position was that not all of these sanctions necessarily come off. Not all of them are related to the nuclear issue. Some of them on human rights, for example, aren't going anywhere. So that was one working group. Let's talk about sanctions. Working group 2 was nuclear. What does Iran need to do to bring its nuclear program back into compliance? What do you do with the several tons of fissile material that it's accumulated that go beyond the JCPOA's cap? How do you account for all of these new centrifuges that it's brought online? Do you destroy them? Do you store them? Do you do something creative with them? Right? These are the technical questions of sanctions relief, nuclear rollback, and the third working group was sequencing. Who does what in what order? None of this happens with a snap of the fingers, right? Iran has a few tons of enriched uranium. It has to go somewhere. How do you do it? Does the US roll back sanctions first? Does Iran roll back its nuclear program first? All of these things are part of a very technical and convoluted dance that continued through the 7th round of negotiations, which was the first one that the Raisi team was engaging in. Didn't go terribly well. They come back in the 8th round, and things start to move a little bit more. By now, I'm talking about January and February, late February of this year. And by the end of March, I think it's fair to say that some people were preparing the white smoke at the hotel in Vienna where these negotiations are happening. It's nicknamed the Asparagus Palace. And we had actually started to draft a statement, a crisis group. One preparing for a contingency where the talks break down, and one where they succeeded. And we shelved both of them for reasons I'll come back to. But in the first days of March of this year, a technical text was essentially complete. The E3 negotiators, so that's the Brits, the Germans, and the French, basically packed their bags and left because their part was done. They had completed their end of the negotiations on the technical side, and it was down to a couple of minutiae, or everyone thought. And Iran was welcoming the IAEA Director General to talk about the issue of safeguards, which I'll come back to in a moment. So it's as a historian, I'm fascinated by when you can actually put your finger on a hinge moment where a process seems to apex and move with momentum going from one direction to the other direction. You can look at the 4th and 5th of March as that hinge point in these negotiations so far. The E3 say they're done, the text is nearly complete, the IAEA is in Tehran to negotiate a safeguards agreement, everything looks like it's in motion, to the point where the European Union was starting to issue invitations for the foreign ministers to come to Vienna and seal everything. That's also when everything starts to unravel. Literally the 4th and 5th of March. On the 5th of March, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, puts out a set of more sweeping sanctions relief demands, essentially asking for a cordon sanitaire of Russian-Iranian trade as the Ukraine war is picking up. The Western powers say there's no way we can address this. The EU decides to put the talks on pause on the 11th of March, and everything since then has, by and large, been trying to contain the damage from that. So we had a series of exchanges between the U.S. and Iran, people sending proposals back and forth. In June, there were some discussions in Qatar. Again, no direct engagement between the U.S. and Iran, but with the EU facilitating. That didn't go terribly well. And then about a month and a half ago, the EU tabled a text on the 21st of July and said, look, this is getting a bit ridiculous. Momentum has been sapped. Here's what we're going to propose. Here's a draft text that we think is the best compromise text that we can come up with as the EU, which facilitates the process and coordinates the JCPOA. And let's come back and use this as the basis for discussion. And so for the first time in 5 months, at the beginning of August, all of the parties are back in Vienna, including the Russians, including the Chinese, including the E3, including the US, and including the Iranians. And they start to hammer out this text. And they make some technical updates because it's been 5 months. Iran's nuclear program has continued to advance. And then everyone thinks, okay, this is looking better. Maybe we're back on the right track. Everyone returns to capitals. Whenever everyone returns to capitals, one of two things happens. Either you make serious political decisions or things languish a little bit longer. And we end up with the latter. The Iranians send their comments to the Americans on the Vienna text, and those are actually substantive. And we see in Tehran that they seem to be getting their ducks in a row in a way that they hadn't over these negotiations. With the meeting of the Supreme National Security Council, the Iranian negotiators are briefing Iran's parliament. The Americans then respond with their own counter-proposal. Then the Iranians send their counter-proposal, which is where we essentially have been sitting over the past few days. And the US, rarely, the EU and the E3 all say this is a step backwards. And it's a step backwards because we're essentially down to two issues that have bedeviled these talks from the start. And on the front page of the draft agreement, these people are experienced that are involved in these negotiations. It actually says on the front of the draft text, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And there's a reason for that. If you have 99% of a negotiated text done, the 1% that's still there is usually the hardest. And the two issues that have remained, that are on the table right now, and I think a part of the pessimism, even from the EU right now, are two Iranian demands that are extremely difficult to meet. And on some things, sanctions, you can debate, well, you take this one off, but keep this one on. You can negotiate certain things. You can negotiate on some of the nuclear technicalities. The two things that are outstanding at the moment, one is Iran asking for political assurances that the US will essentially not renege on the deal a second time. And that matters for economic reasons, because it basically is saying, well, if we get the sanctions relief for the next 2 and a bit years, we don't have a guarantee that we won't go through all of this again. And it's also a political liability, because a lot of the people that are involved in these negotiations right now on the Iranian side were critics of the agreement when it was negotiated, and are now entrusted with trying to restore it from Iran's perspective. So it's a very difficult process for them to come back, have the US renege on the agreement a second time, and essentially have no one to blame but themselves for having been naive enough to enter into an agreement that they have negotiated and have no fig leaf to say, well, we were fooled twice. So that's the issue of guarantees. Biden administration says, look, we can finagle understandings on what the Biden administration can provide. There is no mechanism, as everyone in this room will know, for one US administration to bind its successor. Even a treaty, treaties are very difficult to get into, very easy to get out of. There is no such thing as an ironclad US commitment that goes beyond one administration. Further negotiations won't change that. Nor will the Iranian risk perception dramatically be altered. You can have 2.5 years, that much you can guarantee. What happens after, the Biden administration says, well, we can't make any assurances. You can come into the deal, we can try to work on a stronger agreement that gives a stronger political foundation in Washington. That's the best we can offer. So that's issue one. Issue two is on display right now in Vienna, which is this issue of safeguards. So in 2018, documents came to light showing that in the late 90s and early 2000s, Iran had undertaken certain potentially weapons-relevant nuclear research at facilities that it had not declared in conformity with its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And over the past couple of years, the IAEA has said, our mandate is nuclear accounting. We've gone to these sites now. We've found traces of uranium. We've found evidence of R&D. And we'd like Iran to clarify what happened and where those nuclear materials are. That is the IAEA's accounting mandate. And Iran is basically saying that we'll only do this if, as part of the JCPOA, you give us an assurance that if we give the answers to these questions, you will close this probe. And the Western position is, well, we can't close this probe until we know what your answers are. And we cannot kneecap the IAEA's technical mandate, being a neutral UN body whose very objective is nuclear accountancy, and we cannot sacrifice that at the altar of the JCPOA because it undermines the non-proliferation argument under which the JCPOA itself is predicated. So the JCPOA, the argument for the JCPOA is limits on Iran's nuclear program and intrusive verification and monitoring. That if those monitoring and verification authorities are in doubt, it throws into doubt the very structure and non-proliferation benefits of the deal. That's just how it goes. And so those two issues have been on display since April. They have had marginal room for maneuver in Vienna. It seemed in Vienna in March, again, that Iran was making progress with the IAEA because they agreed to a roadmap with the IAEA to discuss these issues. But as the talks on JCPOA started to go screwy and went on pause, the IAEA inspections also went essentially on pause. So those two things are the circles that at this point have not been squared. And Crisis Group, yesterday we published a report saying that it is entirely possible that these circles cannot be squared. And what happens in that case from a Plan B perspective is very easy to imagine. More US sanctions, perhaps included with more European sanctions, and nuclear escalation on the Iranian side. That's the pattern we've seen since 2018. And what we argue in the report that came out yesterday is that that's the default Plan B. What no one really seems to be thinking through seriously is whether there are diplomatic Plan Bs. If you get to the point where you have to call time on the JCPOA, and at some point the non-proliferation experts on the E3 and US teams will say, I think, that Iran's nuclear program has advanced too far at this point for the JCPOA to account for it. That becomes a technical judgment. And if that's the case, we have different alternatives that in the report, I won't bore you with the details, various negotiation paradigms that you can think about beyond the JCPOA, but essentially our argument is that if restoring a deal that they all agreed to has been this difficult, a more ambitious negotiation is probably not looking great. So perhaps the most feasible option, and again, there could be a deus ex machina that comes in and everything is resolved over the next few weeks, is to focus on more discrete arrangements that focus on limited non-proliferation measures in return for limited sanctions relief that at least caps the escalatory cycle, and also complementing that with an understanding of what not to do. Tripwires that both sides can undertake to at least not make the situation any worse. If Iran increases enrichment further to 90%, which is weapons grade, that would be a profound concern for the US, for the Europeans, for some regional parties that will see that as a drift towards potential weaponization. And it's important to underscore that there is no, at least in the public domain, information that Iran has moved towards weaponization. I'm sorry Kelsey couldn't join us today, but if anyone has questions about the nuclear minutiae of what that actually entails and how worried we should be, spoiler alert, pretty worried, but not to the point of weaponization worried. But that having a couple of red lines that are communicated either by the Europeans or some regional mediators that basically say, how do we stop things from getting worse if we can't make things better? That may be the most modest and humble way to at least prevent what could have been a win-win turning into a lose-lose for all of the parties involved. So I'll stop there.
You answered almost all of my questions. So Barbara, let me ask you, on the US side, some have accused Biden administration of squandering the opportunity when it came to the White House. They said, well, you rejoined the Paris Agreement, you rejoined other agreements, why not the JCPOA, right? And that somehow Biden missed the opportunity. One, do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? And second, what is at stake for the United States if the negotiations fail?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to share this panel with two very experienced Iran watchers. You know, I think Biden did make a mistake at the beginning. I understand the reasons for it. He had a very, very narrow majority. In fact, no majority really. Majority only with Kamala Harris in the Senate. And a lot of what we're seeing, I think, on both sides, both the Iranian side, but especially on the American side, comes down to domestic politics. So Biden knew that to get his cabinet nominees through the Senate, he needed all the Democrats to agree, at a minimum. And he was very worried about some of the more hawkish Democrats who opposed the JCPOA when it was first proposed back in 2015. He was especially worried about a guy named Bob Menendez, who was a senator from New Jersey, very hawkish on the issue of Iran, and an opponent, major opponent of the JCPOA. So to placate people like Bob Menendez, the Biden administration team, people like Jake Sullivan, came up with this idea of a longer and stronger JCPOA, which I've never liked the formulation, frankly. A little bit off color, but never mind. And they said, oh, you know, we're not just going to go back into the JCPOA, we're going to get something better. That was really stupid. It took 12 years to get to the JCPOA. If you look at the negotiations that began back in 2003 with the Europeans, when the Bush administration wouldn't deign to talk to the Iranians because demanded that they basically halt their nuclear program as a precondition just for talks. So it had taken all this time to finally get this deal. And here is Biden now saying, well, we want something better. I understand why they did it. There was another factor, and that is even though Rob Malley, our envoy on Iran, was appointed a week into the Biden administration term, we wanted to make sure that we didn't have the same problems we did under the Obama administration with various US allies and partners and regional friends feeling like they were being neglected. So Malley began this process of consultation, not just with the Europeans, which of course makes sense since they were our partners in negotiating the deal, but with Arab countries, with Israel especially. You know, God forbid that the US should do anything without the Israelis knowing about it first. So this took time, and it took time to get the nominees through the Senate, and that's why we didn't get talks until April, which of course wasted time because we had only April, May, not even really June, before the Iranian presidential elections, which brought in not just a bunch of hardliners, but a bunch of, as Naysan said, people who had virulently opposed the JCPOA back in 2015. It was like asking Mike Pompeo to negotiate the JCPOA in 2013, 14, and 15, people who opposed the deal. So it, you know, there wasn't time enough to get it together. And then it took the new government of Raisi a long time to get its act together, to appoint negotiators, to appear in Vienna to get the talks started again. So do I blame Biden? Yes and no. He was responding to the domestic political realities as he and his team saw it, and they thought somehow that Iran, and here may be a miscalculation, that Iran was so desperate for sanctions relief that it would come back and it wouldn't make a big fuss. Now, during this period, of course, I mean, Iran has been under sanctions of one sort or another for 40-odd years, let's face it. Iran has gotten very good at getting around sanctions. And it was already selling almost 1 million barrels of oil a day when the Trump administration ended. And that was enough. And it was especially enough after the Russians invaded Ukraine and the price of oil went up for Iran to get by. Now, not to thrive, but to survive. And the regime that is in power cares more about survival than the well-being of your average Iranian. This has always been true. There's also a lot of smuggling that goes on. A lot of people get very rich off sanctions, and that includes a lot of people who are part of the elite of the Iranian government. So why rock the boat for a deal that maybe will only be in effect for 2 years, 2.5 years at best, if the Republicans come back into power in the United States? So, I understand why the Iranians have hesitated, but they have adopted a particularly infuriating negotiating tactic, which our negotiators and the Europeans have complained bitterly about, which is they appear to settle an issue and then they walk it back. So it seemed that they had found a formula to satisfy the IAEA. Then they said, no, we want you to promise a date certain to end this probe, and it has to be coordinated with the implementation, the re-implementation of the JCPOA. So the US said, hell no, we're not gonna do that, and the Europeans said no. And I'm reliably informed that the British and the Germans in particular are absolutely furious. So they've basically said, that's it, no more, you come to us when you're ready. So where are we now? Waiting for our midterm elections. Because the Iranians think, and I think the Americans think, this now is not the time to have a debate in the US Congress over the merits of resuming the deal. So better to wait until after the midterms, then you will have a lame duck Congress, which will still be under the nominal control of the Democrats. Congress gets 30 days to get a whack at the deal, if there is one. And most likely it would go through no problem, and then even if the Republicans take over the House of Representatives in January, you could still get the deal back. That's the most optimistic scenario now that I see, that after the midterms, the Iranians finally say, okay, we'll accept the draft that has been waiting since March. We'll come back in, and there we go. Will that happen? I learned long ago not to make predictions about what Iranian officials would do when it comes to these kinds of negotiations, and there are certainly plenty of people in the country who will be quite happy if nothing happens, in which case we wait till our next presidential elections before we have a return to negotiations. And the real concern, of course, is that the situation does not remain as is, but gets worse and worse and worse, and there is an incident. The Israelis decide that they feel like attacking this or that, killing some more Iranian scientists. The Iranians get lucky and kill a dissident in the United States, or kill some American service people in Syria or Iraq, and the whole thing just completely unravels. And then we are in a very bad state. So it's not a great place to be. One final thought, and that is just that, breakout, Naysan mentioned breakout. We are 4 days from breakout. Iran has, as of the last IAEA report, 55 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. In 4 days, they can turn that into enough for a single nuclear weapon, which is the definition of breakout. Why is everybody's hair not on fire? I mean, we were a year from breakout under the JCPOA, and the Israelis still said that wasn't good enough. Because we have so many other fish to fry. We have Ukraine, we have our problems with China. And, it's almost like it's become background noise. Oh, the Iranians are going to try to get a bomb. So what? It's really interesting to me that we don't have the sense of urgency and panic. And that the Israelis, at least their politicians, are still arguing against a return to the JCPOA, even though it would substantially roll back Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium into the year 2031, which still seems like a pretty good bet to me. But it is this peculiar nature of our relationship with Iran and our ability ability sometimes to hype small things out of all proportion and then go, oh, never mind, when there's something really to worry about. It's quite bizarre. Maybe it's just the way the human mind functions. I don't know.
Thank you. Naysan, why, I mean, you kind of touched on it, but why so much delay? Barbara also mentioned, why is it Iranians are losing so much on potentially selling their oil? Why are they not signing off on the deal? Why is there so much back and forth? Why is that they say, oh, okay, well, we'll do something, and then they come back and say, by the way, we have another demand.
Or
Why?
the same demand we dropped.
Or another demand. How's the domestic politics?
Well, so I think you can look at that question, and it may sound like I'm punting, but I'm going to echo some of the things that the head of MI5 said a few weeks ago. So I think he's got better intelligence than I do, and so I think it's okay if it's not entirely clear to me. But scenario one is that the Iranians are prolonging these negotiations with the intent of maximizing their nuclear leverage. Now, whether that's towards an end game of weaponization or towards cajoling even greater concessions, that's a debatable consideration that a few people in Tehran probably have the actual answer to. Scenario two is that they are fully serious and are debating over particular terms that they are not yet satisfied, but if they are satisfied, then there can be agreement. And the third one is that there is actually no internal consensus on what that second factor actually looks like. And I would lean to a certain degree to the third one, at least for the time being, which is that the way that the decision-making process in Tehran goes is that the foreign ministry team is involved in the negotiations. They're representing Tehran at the table. You have Iran's Atomic Energy Agency handling the nuclear portfolio. But on a lot of the strategic decisions, they're handled through the Supreme National Security Council, which, similar to the one here, brings together all of the major stakeholders, from the president and the foreign minister and the defense minister and the head of the armed forces, and basically provides a consensus view to the supreme leader, who then makes a decision. So I am not aware whether at any point in these negotiations process, even when the Supreme National Council has convened, whether they've actually made a decision. Yes, 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 no, or yes, this is exactly what else you need to get from Vienna. Because I think there is this vision of an omnipotent, all-seeing supreme leader that says, no, this is how many centrifuges I'm willing to turn off, or this sanction in particular I'm going to debate on. I don't necessarily get the sense that that's the case. I think he hears what the National Security Council has to say, and then says, this is fine by me, or this is, go back on this. But within the Supreme National Security Council, you do have a lot of people right now who were critics of the agreement, many of them under the Rouhani administration for arguing for a far more robust Iranian counter-pressure strategy early on under the Rouhani team, as in they were saying, well, Rouhani's only raising enrichment from 3.67 to 4.5. Forget that, leave the NPT. Those were the discussions that were being had in Tehran. And many of those people now have at least the ears of some of the people in the Supreme National Security Council, that in the same way that some people will say applying a little bit more sanctions pressure will yield the dividends we're looking for, there it's a little bit more counter pressure, a little bit more nuclear escalation. You hear Iranian officials or advisors talking about the fact that, well, winter is coming in Europe and they need our energy more than we need to give it up right now, right? So if it's a weaponization dash, and I cannot stress enough the point that we are in a certain sense on the nuclear front, frogs in boiling water, and having heard 20 odd years of Iran is on the verge, Iran is on the brink, Iran is about to. Iran is currently at its most advanced point ever in terms of nuclear activity. It is enriching uranium at the highest point it has ever done. Its breakout time is as low as it's ever been, and the IAEA is operating under opacity. From a non-proliferation point of view, and I'm sure Kelsey would agree with me, I would hope she would agree with me if she were here, this should be extremely concerning. Now, there may be political reasons not to sound the alarm bell, because the Iranians would say, well, if you're so concerned, you know exactly how you can get back into, roll this all back, which is agreeing to our terms. And it could be that those in the intelligence community that are aware of exactly what the West and its allies in the region know of Iran's nuclear program, that they are sufficiently assured that if Iran were to divert nuclear material or move towards weaponization, they would know about it. That would have to be the hypothesis. The risk with this is actually best laid out by Prime Minister Netanyahu at the UN in 2012. At that speech, now it's remembered for the bomb visualization that he was holding up, right? But he says something that is actually quite important, which is that once you get to the fissile, having enough fissile material, weaponization doesn't necessarily happen in a declared site where you have cameras and you know what's going on. You can divert that material to a smaller facility, and I think Sina and Barbara have both heard me use this analogy, but think of enriched uranium as the batter, and think of centrifuges as the oven, right? So what the JCPOA does is limit the amount of batter and give very first generation ovens, which makes it very, very difficult to build a nuclear cake. If you get to the point where you have a very advanced oven and you have sufficient batter, the risk is that you can decorate the cake in the pantry. You don't have to be doing it on the kitchen counter, right? This is essentially where we are right now. That Iran over the past few years has developed a lot more batter than it would have had under the JCPOA. It's rolled out considerably more advanced ovens, and we cannot see inside that baking tray right now because we don't have as much real-time access as we would if the agency's monitoring was fully in place, which it hasn't been since February of 2021. So that's why, from a non-proliferation point of view, at least from the outside of the intelligence community, it's concerning. The intelligence community's assessment in Europe, in the US, and in Israel is that there is no detectable move towards weaponization. It's a high stakes and very risky assumption to be going on. That seems to be, I think, at least one of the reasons why no one is
Can I add something to Naysan, and that is that there is no good plan B. You know, we've tried maximum pressure sanctions, and they only made everything worse. And people talk very cavalierly about a military option against Iran. There is no good military option against Iran. You can nibble at the program, as Israel has done, with cyber war and sabotage and assassinating people. But a massive military attack on Iran's 17 declared nuclear facilities, do you know how many people would be killed? Do you know what the radiation that would be emitted, what that could do to innocent civilians? And the United States just got out of Afghanistan and barely is hanging on in Iraq and Syria. Do we really think the American people would support a war against Iran, which is a country of 80 million people, 3 times the size of Iraq? So, you know, people who throw around, oh, well, we'll just bomb the place. No, I don't think so. And it doesn't scare the Iranians, it just makes them angry. And it makes them say, well, we'll show you. So I think the main reason nobody is tearing their hair out is because we really don't know what to do. The JCPOA is all we got.
I think there were some military assessments in 2020 where the estimated setback time in the event of a military exercise, military option being exercised, and this is where you can argue that there's a military option. I think it's very hard to argue that there's a military solution. I mean, those are different things. But if I'm not mistaken, the reporting was that this was 2020 under the Trump administration, and Israeli joint assessments were that a full-fledged military operation would result in a setback of 5 months to 18 months on the outside, and run the risk of reconstituting, which, if you look at Iran's nuclear program over the past 2 or 3 years, a lot of times we've heard prognostications over the impact of an individual covert operation that has turned out to be not entirely accurate. There was a bombing at Natanz in 2020, and intelligence analysts were telling the media that it'll take Iran 2 years to recover from this. It did not take Iran 2 years to recover from that. There was the killing of one of Iran's top nuclear scientists, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, in December of 2020. Iran responded to that by increasing enrichment to 20%, limiting IAEA access, and then in April of last year, there was another attack at Natanz, and the intelligence assessments that were coming out were that it'll take Iran 9 months to recover from this. Iran raised enrichment from 20% to 60% 48 hours later. So if you look at the trend line of stockpiles and centrifuges, the very best you can argue is that covert options may result in some delays. Strategically, there has been nothing that verifiably restricts over a significant period of time the nuclear restrictions that were in the JCPOA, which at least through 2019, and this is vouched for by the Trump administration, Iran was complying with.
Now, I have some more questions, but for the sake of time, I do want to go over some of the points that the critics of the agreement make, and there's plenty of them. And I want you, both of you, to respond and see what you think. And as one of my former professors said, let's unpack them, right? One is that JCPOA for sure will provide a pathway for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Is that a yay or nay? And please back up your arguments for both of you.
Yeah, Iran has the slowest moving proliferation program in the history of nuclear energy. The United States began the program in the late 1950s under Adams for Peace. If Iran really wanted a bomb, it would have one by now. So, the JCPOA, if it is restored, would prevent Iran from having sufficient fissile material for a weapon until the year 2031. How is that paving the way for a bomb? There is no highway here. Iran knows how to make it. It's easy for it to enrich to the proper levels. If it makes that political decision, it will do it. And the JCPOA was a way to at least park this issue for, at that time, 15 years, so that the United States and Iran could begin conversations about other issues. And it was also, let's face it, in anticipation that the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, would pass from the scene, and there might be new Iranian leaders that the U.S. could talk to about a variety of issues, that Iran might change its attitudes, its rejection of Israel's right to exist, its interventionist policy in the region, and so on and so forth. That was the idea behind it. It is not a pathway to a bomb. That's just nonsense. That's propaganda.
So let me start with a bit of context, right? Because we used to hear that line a lot in 2015. And at the time of the JCPOA, there were a lot of criticisms of it, and criticism is absolutely fair, right? No negotiation is perfect, no deal is loved by everyone. I think the ideal outcome of a negotiated agreement is one where everyone is equally dissatisfied. But the position change that the JCPOA acknowledged was that the goal of Iran having zero enrichment, which had been the initial negotiating position and something that had come up in several UN Security Council resolutions, etc., the position was Iran should have zero enrichment. And as long as that was the position, Iran increased enrichment. What the JCPOA did, and this was one of the key things that unblocked the path to a deal in 2015, was that it said you can have a limited degree of enrichment, it's going to be restricted, and over time it can phase out some of the restrictions. So I think that you can say that it's paving the path in the sense that it's conceding the fact that Iran can do anything on the enrichment front. But that's, to a certain degree, a concession to reality. That if you look at 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, when the interim agreement was signed, Iran was just building up. Zero became further away. And then you get to 2018 and the decision to withdraw. I don't regard the JCPOA as divinely revealed text. There's nothing wrong with further negotiations, there's nothing wrong with pointing out the fact that there are improvements that can be made. We wrote a crisis group when the Trump administration came in that it was in a good position as anyone to build on the deal and to negotiate extensions, negotiate discussions that go beyond the nuclear file. But, and this is what, the week before Trump withdrew, Chancellor Merkel, President Macron, and Prime Minister Johnson, Foreign Minister Johnson, I think at the time, came to say was that if you want to build on the agreement, you can't, I think Johnson used the line in a New York Times op-ed, don't throw out the baby with the nuclear bathwater, or something along those lines. And the alternative to having limited enrichment at 3.67 was unlimited enrichment. That's been everything that's happened since. First to 4.5, then to 20, then to 60. So if you believe that it is a pathway to a weapon after 2031, it somewhat perplexes me how the better alternative to that is lifting all of the restrictions 13 years in advance.
You just touched on it. Another claim is that the new deal will be weaker and shorter than the original agreement.
Yeah.
Of course it will, that's Trump's fault.
Well, so time is an interesting construct. 2031, which is when the caps on enrichment and stockpiles phase out, is still 2031. We've just had 3 years where Iran has had a head start on its nuclear activity, which means that they now have 3 years of research and development and irreversible knowledge that they would not have otherwise had. So 2031 is still 2031. Iran will also say that this agreement is weaker because they've lost 3 years of sanctions relief in the process, right? There is a cost to everyone here if the intent is to go back into the deal, because Iran has been under maximum pressure sanctions for, well, especially on oil for 3 and a bit years, but since the withdrawal 4 years. And in the meantime, and this is one of the reasons why the delays in negotiating the deal make the technical text so much more complicated, is that negotiations stalemate. Iran's nuclear program does not. Iran's nuclear program continues to expand on a day-by-day basis. Every day that goes by is another day where Iranian nuclear scientists are working with advanced centrifuges, rolling out much more powerful machines that under the deal would currently be prohibited, and getting know-how. That's one of the reasons, I think, why the E3 in particular and the US see these delays as potentially a red herring from Iran to continue these R&D activities with who knows what ends. But on shorter and weaker, 2031 is still 2031. We're just 4 years on, and weaker is essentially accounting for the advances that it's made in the interim.
Another claim, and this is the last one, that if we enter into agreement with Iran, it's Beijing and Moscow that will benefit from the deal. And so that's why we should not have entered the deal with Iran in the first place.
It's Beijing and Moscow that are benefiting from the lack of the deal. Iran has increasingly, because of US sanctions, when the whole sanctions campaign began, the European Union was Iran's largest trading partner. That was in the middle of the last decade, to the latter part of the last decade. Because of sanctions, Iran's major trading partner became China. Because of sanctions, Iran has doubled down on what it calls its Look East policy. So it has gone so far that it is actually, Ayatollah Khamenei is actually sanctioned as approved of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is something that you would think Iran would not approve of, a neighboring country invading another, given what it suffered during the Iran-Iraq war. So it's absolutely the reverse. Russia and China benefit from the lack of the deal. And many people think, and we've certainly seen evidence, that the Russians are actually dragging their feet and certainly not encouraging Iran to come back into compliance, because they want Iran to remain a member of the coalition of the sanctioned. They want company in their pariah status because of Ukraine. So no, you get the deal back, Iran has options. It can trade with Europe again. It can improve on its trade with its neighbors, its Arab neighbors and other neighbors. It can build on its ties with Asian countries other than China, South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asian nations. Iran is depriving itself of options, and it's being forced now to rely on countries that are increasingly being ostracized by Western democracies.
Last question, and I'll open Q&A. So there's a debate, there's an ongoing debate in Iran that we're already being punished for, allegedly pursuing nuclear weapons. Enough is enough. Let's just get the bomb. Let's just quit the NPT and pursue a weaponization. What are the options for the United States? And what are the regional implications for, let's say, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel?
I'll let Naysan do that one. I already said I don't believe there's a military solution, so.
So the hypothetical is that Iran withdraws from the NPT and makes a dash for it. Okay. Four successive U.S. presidents, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, have all said that the acquisition by Iran of a nuclear weapon is a strategic threat, and it will not happen on their watch. So I start with that as an assumption that the U.S. under this president, I would guess under any president, would essentially have three choices. One is to accept it. I don't think that's on the cards. One is to try to destroy it, which, as we've alluded to before, is an imperfect solution. And the other one is to negotiate. Now, I think that if we continue this hypothesis and say that Iran is not going to go with the declared, it's not we are leaving the NPT and therefore this is what we're going to do. It's that they divert fissile material that we don't know about right now, and at some point just say, oh, P.S. we have achieved a nuclear weapon. So that makes it too late to address militarily. Clearly you can't ignore. And there I think the regional consequences are quite concerning, because I think at that point some of Iran's regional rivals would look at this as something that they may have to check in their own capacity. And I think that the reason four successive US administrations have made this such a point is not necessarily that Iran would, you have three options essentially, right? If Iran were to have a weapon, it would do one of three things, or three concerns. One is that it would use it, which obviously would be quite suicidal in many ways. The other one is that it would use it as an umbrella to expand on the activities which the US and its allies view with concern, and basically have the nuclear deterrent as we can get away with more right now because if you retaliate, we have the ultimate response. And the third one is the proliferation to regional proxies. So all of these scenarios are bad, and I think that's why I don't question when President Biden is asked, as his predecessors have been asked, are all options on the table? I think all options are on the table, even with the proviso that it is an imperfect option. But I think it's also thinking through how awful these consequences are that you start to realize why the negotiations on the nuclear deal have been triaged over all of these other concerns, right? Because one of the issues is, why doesn't the deal cover everything else, right? And the issue is that the nuclear one is, we talk about weapons grade, nuclear, it makes everything else much more difficult to address. There's a reason, the nuclear one, it rises to the top in the hierarchy of concerns. And in negotiations, you're balancing a hierarchy of concerns about a menu of opportunities. The nuclear deal was, this is the concern, this is the opportunity we have to reach an agreement, ergo JCPOA. The Trump administration, I think, still prioritized the nuclear deal, but it said, no, with theory of everything, you can address all of them. The opportunity never came. And I think the Biden administration has basically reverted to the triage approach of the Obama administration, which is that this issue stands above all else. And that, I think if you asked a Biden official, what are your concerns about Iran? They would give you an identical list to the Trump administration, probably expanded. UAVs, ballistic missiles, proxy groups, human rights, right? All of those are concerns because those, again, as I said at the start, have been concerns since Carter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the nuclear one that stands above all of these because of the strategic implications for what it would do for Iran's power projection, for the instability that it could cause in terms of regional non-proliferation cascade, and all of the other concerns that everyone's heard ad nauseum. So the JCPOA isn't a silver bullet, and I cannot stress this enough. It's not a peace deal among friends. It's an arms control agreement among adversaries. That's what the JCPOA is. It's not that suddenly the U.S. and Iran will become aligned on a range of issues, even though every one of the presidents I mentioned has at one point or another had tactical engagement with the U.S. Carter on hostages, Reagan in Iran-Contra, Bush on hostages, Clinton on the short-lived détente in the late 90s, Bush on Afghanistan, Obama on JCPOA. Trump is actually the exception in that there were very, very few even tactical engagements. But
a few hostages released.
A few hostages released, yes, that's absolutely right. But that's, I think, the fundamental thing to bear in mind is that it's an arms control agreement, and arms control agreement has risen to the hierarchy of concerns because of the threat it would represent to U.S. interests, but also in particular to U.S. allies.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to open the discussion. If you have a question, raise your hand, introduce yourself. Ma'am, go ahead.
My name's Molly Grace. I'm in the MAIA program. A while back, I read an article, I think it's called Bringing the Bomb Out of the Basement, and it kind of talked about Israel possibly loosening their grip on nuclear ambiguity and ensuring the non-proliferation regime.
Mhm.
Do you think, how do you think that would change, or if that would change, or if that would ever happen?
One of the things, Israel always goes, oh, Iran is an existential threat to us. Well, Israel has at least 90 nuclear weapons, according to SIPRI, the Swedish Institute for Peace Research. So Israel is an existential threat to Iran, not the other way around. But nobody ever talks about it. Why? Because Israel never joined the NPT. It developed bombs covertly. And it has an official government policy that it doesn't admit, doesn't deny, and the U.S. loyally does not admit, does not deny. It's nonsense. I think one of the best outcomes of all of this would be for Israel to declare its nuclear arsenal openly, and talk about a negotiation, talk about a change of attitude toward Iran and vice versa. The Israelis, I think, would be very willing to talk to the Iranians. It's the Iranians who refuse to talk to Israelis, who won't even let their athletes participate in competition with Israelis overseas, who have this policy, of rejecting the right to exist of a country that has been recognized by the United Nations for more than 70 years. So this issue is the reason, I think, one of the main reasons why the United States and Iran are still at each other's throats more than 40 years after the Islamic Revolution. And if the Israelis were willing to come forward and say, look, this is what we got, and we'll open up to IAEA inspection, it would make it harder for Iran to complain that it's being discriminated against by the IAEA and other international institutions. I think it would be very useful.
You have a question? Yep, please. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been a very informative panel so far. So, assuming the baking of the clandestine nuclear cake, how likely is Iran to alert the global community to its nuclear weapon right away? Do you think it's more likely to hide its strength and bide its time, or reveal its hand at a time of maximum opportunity?
So I'm trained as a historian, and it's heresy for me to engage in counterfactuals or hypotheticals. But the only thing I'd say to that, because we're jumping about 3 steps, right? One is that we're assuming the negotiations failed. We assume that Iran is moving towards weaponization, and then we're moving into the stage where how do they decide to declare it? Do they maintain it as a wink and a nod, as the Israelis have done? You know, the Israelis always say we won't be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East, but we won't be the second. So I think that it goes too far down the path that I'm comfortable trotting to get into that level of hype. I mean, Sina, you've worked on nuclear doctrine, I think, more than I have, so I'll punt that to you.
So on the issue of Iran's nuclear, I mean, if there is a nuclear weapon, the concern is that if Iran goes nuclear and they declare that their nuclear weapon, Israelis will be forced to come out and say, guess what, we have it too, because of the requirements of deterrence. They cannot hide behind the nuclear capacity and say, we don't know whether we have nuclear weapons or not. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think this is one regional consequence. And the second problem with that is with the Saudis. Saudis have said many, many times that if Iran goes nuclear, we are going to nuclear. And it's a rational response to an Iranian nuclear weapon. And this is one of the reasons that I personally think, and I've been studying Iran's nuclear program for a while, that one of the reasons that Iran will not weaponize is if Iran goes nuclear, the Saudis will for sure go nuclear, and then the Israelis have nuclear weapons, and then you have three countries that they don't necessarily like each other, they don't talk all the time, and they have, I mean, they're neighbors to some extent, and they all have nuclear weapons. So who's deterring who here, right? That would be a difficult question to answer. And Iranians have said it. One of the arguments that Zarif made years ago is that he said that we believe that nuclear weapons will not provide enough security benefits for us, right? And I think that this is one major reason that Iran will not weaponize. But again, I mean, I hope that I'm not wrong, but I think Iranians have always been interested in having the option of perhaps one day going nuclear. The Shah has said it many times, and I mean, the Iranian officials have, like the current regime, they've pointed out that maybe someday, right?
I would very much encourage them to make that not anytime soon.
Yes.
Hi, Samuel Chen, studying IA, concentrating in national security. So based off this like really awesome panel you guys put together so far, it seems to me as if whether we like it or not, the Iranians are going pretty far with the nuclear program, and I'm more than a little worried that we are in a position of weakness at the moment when it comes to who holds the cards, really. And we just touched base on it with a few of the questions, but if the United States cannot on its own utilize even maximum pressure with our own sanctions in order to at least give the Iranians a shout out of like, hey, like we still have options too. Would it be better for regional stability in the Middle East if we were to leverage the Saudis and the Israelis' potential nuclear capabilities as like yet another piece of leverage? Or do you think that would be yet more unnecessary escalation, assuming that the Iranians are willing to pursue that nuclear weapons program regardless?
Well, the Israelis already have 90 nuclear weapons. I would not like to see Mohammed bin Salman in his hands on nuclear weapons, given the sort of judgment that he has exhibited over the last 5-6 years. I think that would be a terrible idea, so I hope that never happens.
I think one option would be for the United States to make sure the Saudis don't get their nuclear weapons, but provide extended nuclear deterrence. For example, one option would be for the United States to deploy its nuclear weapons to Saudis and say, we provide you, we station our nuclear weapons here.
Like a nuclear umbrella?
Aircraft carriers.
And they have aircraft carriers. Pardon?
Like a nuclear umbrella, but for the Middle East?
Yes, an extended nuclear deterrence. Something that actually the United States used to provide for Iran.
Well, we do for South Korea, for example, and
Or-
Japan.
Yeah.
That's how we convince them not to develop their nuclear weapons.
I see. Thank you.
Yes, something has been forgotten is that Iran and the United States had a mutual defense agreement in 1959. It was an executive agreement, not a treaty, that obliged the United States to come to the defense of Iran if it is attacked. And that included use of nuclear weapons, right? It's a forgotten story, but yes, there was such an agreement. Yes, sir.
So let's assume that Netanyahu wins the election in Israel and the Congress flipped here. So how would be the situation like then? Affecting negotiations and
That's a great
everything.
question.
I don't know that it would change that much. I mean, the declared policy of every Israeli politician is that they don't like the JCPOA. Where we've seen some wiggle room is on the part of Israeli security and intelligence officials, many of whom now say, we wish we had it back, because they see now that it actually was valuable because Iran was in compliance with it. Netanyahu, I mean, what more can this man do? He was blocked in his efforts to attack the program back in 2012. And since then, the Iranian program has become much larger, more diffuse. Much of it is buried underground. Any opportunity that the Israelis had to really destroy the program was gone a long time ago. It would just give Iran an incentive to actually reconstitute the program. So I think I can't imagine what more Bibi can do. He's really shot his wad on this issue. He helped convince Trump to quit the deal. That's on him.
We have time for one last question. Sir, yes?
I'm Aiden Turley, I'm with the IA program.
Speak up,
Can't
please.
hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Aiden Turley, I'm with the IA program. I was wondering, is there any point of no return in terms of Iranian action if it were to actively pursue getting nuclear weapons? Is there any point when they've achieved a point of nuclear development where negotiation won't do anything? There's no means to really ensure that we can't roll back that development.
Negotiations are always possible. Look at all the arms control treaties we've had with the Soviet Union and with Russia. So I don't think that's ever the case. But Iran, I mean, if it goes for a bomb, it's not going to go for one bomb. It's going to go for several, because one bomb is useless. But whether arms control is arms control. So I think we would still have diplomacy. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a study years ago that if Iran goes nuclear, they would produce a dozen nuclear warheads. Yeah, as Barbara said, one is sure not enough. Okay, I guess this is it. We can wrap it up. Thank you everyone for coming. Appreciate it.